Hi, my name is Benedict for Higher Hertz. In this episode, we are looking at the shiny new Volcano 3 from Fab Filter. Third time round for them, and I think that they have transitioned it from being a good plugin to a very interesting plugin. And I'll be upfront, I'm going to reorder the way I do some of this time, because I'm not going to be going through the same stuff as everybody else is going through. I always try to find a different angle on the thing that I'm looking at. And this, I looked at it and I thought, oh well, this finally looks to be a rather interesting and cool device. Nothing against it before, it just, I didn't need it. With Reason, a lot of the things that are done here have always been done in Reason. And I'm happy with the filter sounds that I've got, but this presents a little differently. So we'll take a quick look at what it is and the usual suspect approach. So most people will say, ooh, here's this charming, lovely sound, and we can make it do this. And yes, this is the heart of what Volcano is designed to do. It's a set of up to 4 filters, synth filters primarily, that you can modulate and do stuff with. Notice how the modulation rate is changing. So we've got modulators modulating modulators. It's relatively deep, and that is cool and interesting. Let's just turn that off for the moment before it becomes too annoying. We can have up to 4 points, the usual double-click, create a point. Turn it off, turn it on, delete it, the usual thing. FabFilter have developed a pretty darn strong way with making GUIs. Are they perfect? No, I don't think so. But are they visionary and changing the way a lot of people do things? Yes, most definitely. Basically, with each of these points, these filters that you create, and while this looks like an EQ, and we're going to use it that way, it is actually still a set of synth filters. So here I've got a high pass, here I've got a low pass, and in the middle I've got a big stonking band pass. Other options being a bell, which looks suspiciously like an EQ, doesn't it, boys and girls? And then high and low pass filters, which we can set the frequencies with, we can drag around and do what we like with. High shelf, low shelf, notch, which is just always going to rip whatever is in the notch out of existence. And an all pass, which I've never really made my peace with all pass filters. I know that they're important for making phasers, but I've still never made my peace with them, so I'm not going to talk about it. Each of these filters then has some options, and here's where it gets interesting. You've got a good collection of drive types involved with them. They're more saturation than, slash playing death metal drive types, but they can be pushed fairly hard, especially bearing in mind that you can have them gang up on each other, or on your sound, as the case may be. So classic being the old FabFilter 1 filter style, smooth, raw, hard, hollow, which is a very interesting sound, extreme gentle tube, metal, which is a rougher tube, easygoing, and clean, which most of us would know as the Pro Filter Q. Or the FabFilter Pro Q. You've got to get all your words in the right order. And it is just clean and tidy. We're not hearing anything because I turned it off because the modulation was annoying me. We can control the drive. Now this drive is pretty well balanced, so as we push an extra 18 dB in, we're not particularly getting 18 dB of gain, but the plugin overall is not gain compensated. While that can be an issue for some, I don't see it as being a necessary. Wouldn't mind, wouldn't be opposed if there was a button for doing that, but you can access the input gain, the output gain, and if you're one of those people who likes to do all of your things in some sort of mixed ratio, you can do that as well. ain't for me. But it's there. But each of these filters you can change the level of. So we could take filter 3, which is currently a high pass, we could push it up, and then filter 2 is pulling it back, which means that filter 1 we could be driving real hard. Let's go with extreme. This is going to sound nasty. We can then go to our number 2 filter. Push that hard as well. Go for broader Q. And it's, again, not necessarily going to get you into death metal territory, but it is interesting. And then, of course, our low pass filter, which we can... And you can get a pretty fiery result from it. You then have this modulation thing that they've brought in. That comes from FabFilter Twin, their second synthesizer, I think, or maybe third. And it's very capable indeed. So you create some kind of modulator, and there are a few that you can create. You can have just a slider, which is used to control one or many things at once. So by moving your slider, just like in a combinator, you can have it add some here, subtract some there, and do this, and lots of things in one spot. XY controller, so your pad things, LFOs, envelope generator and envelope follower, which we will look at quite a lot, or just from MIDI. You can pull in from MIDI, which means this does actually work very nicely as a slave or replacement on a MIDI line. It won't go polyphonic, but if you are happy to sacrifice and go paraphonic, meaning you play a chord and the one filter operates across the whole chord, and a lot of string machines were paraphonic, then you will find that it's surprisingly capable. Of course, with single monophonic stuff, you can either have the envelope follower trigger, how the filter filters, or you can actually send it the MIDI notes, and it can do your MIDI tracking and open and close and what have you based on your MIDI. Nicely done indeed. You can then have modulators modifying other modulators. That's when it gets a little bit more complex, and I question the wisdom of this approach. While it looks great and is incredibly versatile, it's also relatively easy to actually get lost because things are never in the same place. While people got used to the whole iPad that every time you press a button the whole world rearranges itself, it can be a little confusing to be able to kind of keep in your head what's going on when your modulator was here, now it's over here, but next time you create it, it'll probably be there. There's this feeling of things moving around. Obviously, over time, you would get more and more used to it. But coming in for the first time, it's like, wow, this is sort of super cool, but after a while, the layers can start to become obscured simply by the fact that everything is moving around, rather than knowing that your LFO1 is always here, your LFO2 is always here, and that your mod matrix is always here, and that you're assigning them through this. But people don't like mod matrix, they like this whole kind of, here, let's drag this to something and make it do something. So that's the overview. It's a very, very interesting sounding device. Let's look at where it's come from. FabFilter. Huge name in the industry, really huge name in the industry. Slight beef with them in that they're possibly part of the whole driving the word pro into a rather negative situation, but their product is good. I will be super honest and say I don't own any, I don't use any of their product. For some reason, it just doesn't gel with me, but I'm one of those outsider types who tends to find different things and use different things. So you'll find me using products that you might think are kooky, but that's just me. But it doesn't mean that I can't admire the goodness of what FabFilter are doing and the interestingness of what they're doing as being like, wow, that's super impressive. So they've built their name around essentially high quality filtering and become super famous, of course, for their equalizer plugin, compressors, and Saturn, the noise-making plugin. All of that kind of rolls together into Volcano 3, and they're moving all their functionality into all of their devices being kind of similar, which is also a positive in many, many ways. One of the things that I've always liked about Reason is that at least every Reason Studios Propeller Heads product, every device that's in there, has very much the same kind of thinking. So it doesn't matter what thing I drag in, they tend to behave the same way. So rather than having to learn again that, oh, this dev thinks this way, or this developer thinks this way, and having to reinvent the wheel every time, having a consistency of your compressor, your EQ, your limiter, your whatever, including a synthesizer in this case, can all operate under the same paradigms is actually a pretty powerful thing. So a lot of positives about FabFilter. Device price, $129 US. So not cheap. However, bearing in mind the quality of what you get, I think is probably pretty fair. The good and bad. Well, what's good is it sounds great. The FabFilter stuff always sounds great. It can be a sound that everybody's using, but that's simply because if you're getting the same sound as everybody's using, you're just not using it right. You're not implanting your own personality on it. And if you're one of those people who thinks, oh, well, mixing's all about getting it right, getting the perfect sound, then you haven't got to that stage in your career where you realize it's about uniqueness. If everything's the same, what's the point? Why would we buy another record if it's going to be exactly the same as the first one? And I know there are plenty of records out there. I hear a lot of things, like on YouTube under so-and-so's Genre X channel where he pulls in record after, and I'm trying not to pick on anybody here, record after record, and sort of open them up, and within a few seconds you're like, sounds the same as the last 10 of them I listened to. It's just like, this is not how you get anywhere. You'll have people say, yeah, great, mate, because it sounds exactly like every other record they're listening to. But there's no reason for them to go, oh my god, Justice, that's just like such an amazing record, because there's no other record that sounds or feels quite like Justice. But sounds great. If you've got an issue with that, it's probably just because you're not doing the work. A little bit of a sidestep, but I think an important one. It has nice saturations. We are getting to the point in the digital industry, in the DAW space, where most people are delivering very interesting sounding distortions. Saturation being distortion, just a milder, more take-home-to-mama kind. The modulation system is really good. It really is. The bads, because we should raise some, only 4 filter points. You've got other devices who've got 6, so I don't know whether that's going to be a CPU problem or whether you've just sort of thought, oh, well, for a filter plugin, nobody's going to need more than 4 points. But technically, if we could, I wouldn't mind having them there. The envelope follower does not have a threshold, and I kind of wonder at that, because I know you've got the technology, because you've got a compressor that, compresses nicely, and it has a threshold. Why'd you not think to put a threshold on the envelope follower, so that rather than following and starting its curve from nothing, that you can say, well, let's ignore this bit and start our curve from here. Standard compressor kind of stuff. You'll see why I raise that as an issue, because of the case that I'm using it for here, even though it's outside of the official case. And as I've already said, it can get a bit layered in the GUI stuff when getting deep in modulation. So let's have a look at the way that I have used FabFilter Volcano here. I already had a piece. It's for a next record of my own. It's got a goth tinge to it. Classic goth, not that sort of modern techno-y thing. Classic, beautiful goth with slight elements of something exotic in it. And it was already mixed and done, fully finished. And then I thought, you know what, this is a really cool device and it's very interesting. What if? So what if I replaced all of my past synth, you know, every filter and EQ past the synthesizer with Volcano 3. And then, hang on, in the process, I could be doing compression with that. So anything that's related to EQ, compression, and the like has been replaced. So all of the EQs here, like a track EQ, let's pick one that had some actual EQ done on it, all turned off. And everything has been replaced with instances of Volcano. So we can see Volcano appearing on every single track. Normally only one instance, because I tried to be very efficient. Not that I had any problems with the CPU, just because initially I thought, oh, well, I'll have to have a Volcano here and a Volcano here. And then I realized, hang on, no, I've got enough points in most cases to actually be doing several things in the one box. Benedict really likes the idea of doing several things in one box. He starts talking about himself in third person. So where I had, say, an EQ and a compressor, I could put them all into one box. So sometimes 2 or 3 devices end up being rolled into one. Is it the way you would always do it? Not necessarily, but the fact that this could allow me to do that and get a really good working result, very interesting. And exactly the same here. Look at the master. We have a Volcano, and that's it. Oh, well, it's a limiter. It doesn't provide brick wall or peak stop limiting. So that is handled here with primarily a soft clip. There's a limiter there, but it's slow, and a soft clip is the thou shalt not pass. Reverb was already there, so it's kept. So we'll A-B to start with. Oh, number 2 is the original. It's a mix down here. And number 1 is the live version that you're hearing here. You'll hear it's not always the same. One you may personally prefer over the other, but I don't think there's any sense of more rightness or wrongness. We start to get a little bit lively. I keep adjusting the Volcano version. Before I thought maybe it was a little dark, but sounded great, really open and kind of this depth, which really actually worked very nicely with the gothy sort of feel, that sort of Cure, nothing left but faith thing. Here, at least in the headphones, I'm wondering if it's a little too bright, but there's no right or wrong here. Some of the synths inside the mix have come out quite differently, but overall, sort of very, very interesting, and then it all hammers back in again. So again, no right or wrong. My mixing style tends to have a lot more mids. So that can cause some people to go, that's not right. But I love clarity. And especially if you're going to turn the level down, I love clarity. Because there's this feeling of intimacy. Some people don't, and so they want that darker, all the mids are kind of disappearing into the distance. Not necessarily any right or wrong, despite In fact, some people often try to approach me and go, "This, like, yeah, grow up, do some work, come back and chat to me then." So let's have a little bit of a look through. I guess we'll start with drums. You'll want to start with drums. So they are coming from just a set of samples. The main kit is going through a local reverb, a really nice old school year 2000 kind of digital reverb there. And of course everything is going to the space reverb over here. So if we bypass this, a really nice old-fashioned, very gritty, broken apart kind of reverb. And then this Fab Filter instance. Let's just set ourselves into a loop. I've wanted that kick to have a nice punch, a low kind of punch, without having any kind of woodiness. So a peak and fairly aggressive, just kind of rip that out there. So here, just gotten rid of that. It's difficult sometimes to locate which one you're on. So really pulled that out. The rest of the kit's all coming through here. That's it. Tube drive. That affects probably more the upper instruments. Just adds a little bit of brightness, a little bit of sheen to the higher instruments. They're all samples, so it is nice to put a little bit of movement back into them. Very simple. Then we've got the snare, which is not so simple. The snare has got a few things going on. You might notice that there is a little bit of a noticeable difference between my version and the Volcano version, in part because this relies on a compressor to do certain things. So we've got quite a lot of reverb in the reverb mix, but we've also got this extra reverb which is coming in. Just mute this guy for now. Want that really huge sound, typical in goth records, because they're quite sparse, so there's a lot of space to make this enormous snare sound that's right forward in the mix. And then a lot of the way that at least I do that, to make the most of that, is compression. So I've used an envelope generator in transient mode. Now, transient mode is not quite the same as the normal envelope generator mode. Envelope generator mode carries the whole envelope. So a compressor will carry the whole envelope. It'll say, okay, we've still got level here, we'll keep you down. Whereas a transient mode is different. It took me a little bit to sort of get my head, well, why would I want that? Because in this case, I really only want to respond to the transient of that snare. I just want that transient of the snare to push the reverb down so that it comes back up again. So you get the snare with the beginning of the reverb, it goes down, it comes back up again, and it gives this feeling of that makes you feel like that snare is even bigger. It's tricky, and it didn't work out quite the same here as it did with my usual compressors, and that's part of why I think having a threshold, saying, okay, I only want you to act from, say, here, would probably help it behave more like a normal compressor. But this was never designed primarily to be a normal compressor, but it is interesting that you can do it. So a little bit of the old extreme, and we get that sound. If we flip back to the original, better turn the reverb back on. Now with the extra treble boosts that I did yesterday, it probably sounds bigger. But that's interesting in the sense that here I've got one device which is handling not only my EQ but and filtering. It's adding saturation and it's acting as a compressor. Very interesting, adding a lot of character to the sound, and by doing it all in one place rather than in several places, then that's a more organic kind of a feel. Because if you do your EQ and then you do your compression, or you do your compression and then you do your EQ, while they're related to each other and they can sound great when you get it right, it's not the same kind of relationship as when you're doing them all at the same time. It's EQing and compressing at the same time. So, very interesting approach. Chimes didn't have anything on it because there was no processing on that at all. The bass. A couple of EQ type points. The bell, the tube. And then a second point, which is the help pull through the mix, the higher stuff. Again, with a little bit of saturation. Now, I didn't cover this before because it's more relevant to cover here. Once you've got more than one filter running here, more than one point, then you can decide how they actually interact with each other. You can have number one feeding number two, not feeding number three, or you can have all of them doing their jobs separate from each other, in which case we're getting some drive happening at point 1, some happening at point 2, some happening at point 3. Or we can have one, whatever one is adding, pushing and then being added to by whatever 2 is adding, and then being added to by whatever 3 is added to. Oh, that was one thing I really would kind of like to see, the ability to rearrange the naming and numbering. Because at the moment, because the first thing that I input was 1, it's up there. But probably it'd make more sense to put it down there. Or there'd be times where I'd say, look, because I've got 1 going to 2 going to 3, I might want to rearrange that. The EQ that I use, Q range, there's a button where you can press it and it will actually just rearrange. So it would go, okay, I'll put 1 here, 2 here, and 3 here. So it rearranges the name and the ordering. It would be nice to have some sort of way of shuffling the ordering. Like I might say, I actually want that to be process 1, that process 2, rather than then going, oh, I have to redo all my work to get my routing the way that I wanted to do, because I only worked out what routing I wanted after I had done the actual processing and found the points that I liked. That is a thing that I would very much like to see, and I'm a little surprised it's not there already. Maybe they just didn't see people like me coming, but it seems a little odd they didn't. But nonetheless, adding nicely to the bass sound because we're adding several layers. That's off. Just that subtle sense of adding a grittiness. You know, it's kind of like polishing aluminium until you get that nice scratchy across it, and so it feels really, really good. This all goes into a rhythm bus. So everything you've seen, drums, bass, all go to come together in the rhythm bus. So the rhythm bus has EQ to help pull everything together and compression. So we're running high pass to get rid of the murk with a little bit of saturation. A bell to give a little bit of a push at about 74. Again, a little bit of compression, and we just want to pull out some of this at, in this case, 730, and again, a little bit of drive, and overall, filter 1 output level, which is here. Now, because of the routing, filter 1 is driving what's happening in 2 and 3, and to me it seems odd. Is that the best way of doing it? I'm not looking to make a dynamic EQ in this situation. I could have routed this to the peak or the gain and done this dynamic EQ thing, but no, it's routed to the level, so it's doing this thing, which means that it works what's called wideband, as in across the whole thing. But again, just that ability to rearrange the points. I should have ended up with that in the bad, because it's at least problematic for me. It's well, to me it's a little bit of a killer negative, because in Reason I'm so used to the fact that if let's say I had layered up 3 or 4 filters in this way, one feeding another. If I said, oh look, I want to change this around, I would just drag this device, shift drag this device in front of the other, it would reroute for me. So it's a case of being used to it, doing it already, and this is putting it all into one plugin, which is great for non-Reason users. However, it doesn't give people all the facility of. And I still like the idea a lot, even as a Reason user, to have this one box that, oh, it does all these things. It's quite cool. So, pre-Volcano. Post-Volcano. Thank you. You can hear by having them interact with each other, we've really got a lot more punch and a lot more excitement, a lot more reality to it. Oh, there are then these little funny loops. From a mini pops. They're quite dramatically turned down in level. I can't remember where I did that. Oh, here, obviously one of these points has dropped a lot of level, but we're still running through tubes and various other forms of saturation, all just adding that little bit of EQ. Loud. Because it's a secondary drum kit that sits inside our main boom splat to give a nice kind of a roll. And apart from the level difference that you can't, which makes it really hard to A-B, possibly should have thought to put the level outside of this, but I wasn't thinking about doing the A-B at the time, then we do end up with a nice kind of shine to that. This one's a little bit of a complex one. The pluck is really one instrument, which is this. Takes a simpler roll as we get in. So one synth that's being fed a massive stream of notes, and that has got a pair of points. First one, really adding a lot of drive. We want to sparkle that right up. Don't want it to seem like a flat synthy sound. Want it to feel like it could be somebody playing some kind of, I don't know, odd Middle Eastern kind of instrument. Don't know what it is. It's not supposed to be anything real. It's an exotic feel, and the drive helps create that feeling of the instrument having a real presence. Second one's just rolling off some of the lower stuff because we've got a pair of instruments. One's pushing more on the top, the other's pushing a little more in the bottom. So just a little bit of crossover, basically, in the EQ. Again, we've got a little bit of saturation one pushing into the other, which creates a more complex kind of saturation, which is very, very nice. In the sense that you apply one saturator, yeah, it's kind of good, but then you're prone to applying more of it, and it just starts to get a little bit like, oh, this is distorted. Whereas if you've got a subtle saturator with a little bit going on, moving into another subtle saturator with a little bit going on, oddly enough, you don't end up with, even though you might have the same numbers of drive, you don't end up with the same kind of result. As long as you're careful, you find that they kind of do this, which is far nicer than that. So we get that sound lively, and that goes into the next one, which is a little lower in the pair and provides a more precise definition. Because if we listen to the first one, because there's that flood of notes, it can get a little unclear as to where the actual melody points are. So we pop in the second one, which actually just... little like having a second player, but it just pulls it together because the second one doesn't have that flood of notes continuing to come and re-trigger it. It's just picking out the straight point. So it clarifies the actual melody for us. And this we're using the filter with quite a bit of drive, the metal for character, and even though I'm looking for mostly this, I'm happy to boost this to put it together with the upper instrument that's got quite a lot of going on. We want to pull the two together. So even though you might think I'd be rolling off here, it just seemed nicer to pull the two together, which is really achieved here in the pair. So I've picked my point where I really want that instrument to feel unique. Rather than the approach of, oh, what can I cut? What should I cut? I really abhor that approach. It's, where's the character in this instrument? What character do I want this instrument to have? You know, like where given hi-hats and all the energy is dried up here, that's going to interfere with everything. I will go, okay, where do I want it to speak? And create a point maybe here, which is below the brights. It'll actually make the brights easier to deal with because I can probably pull the level of the whole instrument down. It'll feel like it's got a much nicer presence. So here I've gone through and go, okay, where do I want that instrument to feel like it's got its unique speak? By doing that in a bus to the pair of them, it helps pull them together. I don't want a lot of low end coming out of this. It's not a bass. And then just adding a little bit of overall brightness and the compression. Let's just... It's a little brutal there, but what that does again is just helps focus on the beginning of the melodic parts rather than allowing that wash of oncoming MIDI notes to overtake and roll. So it's a kind of a ducker at that point. So we get a really interesting sound to start ourselves off, and then this. Now by rights I could have looked at doing the chorus on board here. I took a quick run at it, didn't feel like I was going to get there. Now I'm not saying that this isn't going to work for choruses, but I didn't feel like I got there. I already got the sound that I wanted, I didn't think it was entirely necessary to push this as being a chorus as well, even though in theory it can do chorusing, because you may have noticed that there's a filter delay. So you can delay and modulate that delay and actually get choruses, phases, flanges, what have you. There are some in the patches. Took a quick run through them. None of them felt like they were quite going to solve what I wanted here. What I wanted here was that kind of, to give you an example, again, nothing. Well, the Faith album from The Cure, which is, to me, is just kind of like an epitome of goth, that along with Clan of Zymox's Twist of Shadows. So this was that low sound. Now, because the sound is the way that it is, this can resonate too much. You see that peak there, it can resonate too much. So again, using the envelope follower, but rather than using a wideband compression, I've created a point here that becomes a dynamic EQ. It just controls that without having to use compression across the whole signal. Compressing the whole signal will mean that as that bit gets a bit annoying, I've either just got to permanently EQ it out, which means that I lose the warmth of that signal, or I'm going to push the whole level down. And because it's such a warm sound, it does still need to have an ability to pull through into the mids so that we actually hear it. So solving the problem with a dynamic EQ, and there's no reverbs or anything to get warped out of shape here. I know some of you go, but you said in the last one, it's like, yeah, you got to pick your cases. This is an EQ case, and I'm not messing with reverbs or room spaces in the process. And it gives us the ability to get rid of the slop, keep this in control, and that hollow. That is a really nice saturation sound. Obviously, it's really controlling what partials are created, what overtones are created, but it is tubular, and that's really, really perfect in this situation. Absolutely perfect in this situation. So it's helped bring that sound into the mix in a well-controlled but lively sort of a way. It then goes into its EQ. So, sorry, not its EQ, it's into its sort of reverb space, because we've got this. Where am I here? So by putting that after the EQ, none of it's really affected. Yes, it flows through, but sometimes I'll put things like that before, sometimes I put them after. In this case, it was safer to put it after. We then got the high string. Now, the high string comes in fairly early. A lot of things don't play straight away because they're all got humanization on them. I put a lot of time into this in the original version right from the beginning because it had a very, very clear and defined role. It does do a little bit more musical stuff later, but it's a pedal point instrument, so it largely just holds. There's a little bit of movement because it has to move a little bit, otherwise it would cease to be relevant. Plus, it just sounds so great, move a semitone or something like that, or a tone. It's that really nice, close, new wave goth movement. But it needs to be bright and carry this feeling of clean and clear through the otherwise slightly kind of feel. In which case, it's a case of clearing out anything here without being aggressive. Adding a bit of boost, again using that hollow. how it brightens up. And I did struggle with this, not because there's anything wrong, but just because I'd got such a very specific sound that I'm trying to duplicate it, just in getting that to fill out and move through the whole piece. But it sounds great. You know, if there was no sense of comparison, there'd be no sense of comparison. Oh, that's moving. That's going into the phaser. It is a filter effect, but in this case, it's going into the phaser. Again, didn't feel like Volcano was necessarily going to do it, or if it did, it was probably going to take me too long to work it out myself to do it. I had the sound I wanted. No harm in using a phaser into a really nice chorus, because it was already the right sound for me. We then have this flute. Surprisingly simple Europa patch going into an echo. Pretty subtle here, mostly just making sure that the fundamental doesn't get out of control, so using the low pass there, and each one of these just bringing in a little bit of saturation. I pushed it, but I kept the easy going because it has a nice relaxed sort of feel, and I want this flute to have a nice relaxed feel, because even though the piece itself has this sort of trudging, pushing forward sort of feel, I want this point to be kind of a sense of ease. There's no point having one tone in your piece. I get tired of records where you turn them on, first song, it's like, oh yeah, okay, that's pretty cool, that's a nice tone, and then 3 minutes of that one tone. There's no change in feel. Next song, oh, guess what? It's exactly the same damn tone. Third song, I am expletive deleted out of here. It's really important to change your tone and your variety. So this provides that break, along with the fact that we've relaxed the instruments and brought up the hand drums. Just giving us a nice sense of saturation and presence on that instrument. And then the final instrument appears just at the end, because we have everything going and it was getting a little hard to clarify that melody. So this sound just pushes home that melody. Roll off all the lows. We do not need those. We're pushing quite a lot of drive into this, but using the easygoing. I want the sound to have a lot of character, but for people not even necessarily notice that it's there. It's just got to, as I say, fill things out. It's got to make sure that we're just really hammering that nail home at the end. So we roll off all of this because we've got the drums and that bass in that territory, as well as the low sort of pure synth sound is owning this area. We don't want to fill that up with this sound, and then rolling off again on the top end. Actually, no, this one was just gentle, so we weren't doing a lot here. It was this point here that I pushed with the easygoing, just even though we're rolling this off, to give a sense of character to this, but it's not going to pick up or be disturbed because a lot of this is rolling off as well. So we get a boost. We change the tone and the feel of our sound quite a lot because we're really pushing it into distortion territory. if you listen closely, you can actually hear it starting to distort, a little bit of intermodulation happening there. But that's good because in the end, it settles in. And just drives home that piece. If you've got to that point and you're like, oh, that's really, really nice, we've gone through the breakdown. And it gives us back that familiar melody, which is right where we started. Then, onto the master bus. You probably wouldn't expect to do this here, but I've learned over the years that what real mastering is, or real finalizing does, is often very, very different from a lot of the really ridiculous over-the-top stuff you get told in forums, from speaking to actual mastering engineers and just watching the right stuff on YouTube, talking to where it's real professionals, not like I've won 27 Grammy Awards in my imagination guys talking, because all they're doing is advertising. But when you listen to a real old hand speaking in old school ways, then you find that what's done is a lot simpler, meaning you can do it a lot simpler. So in this case, as you see, my mastering is really nothing more than this working as a kind of an EQ and saturator. That's just to make sure that my levels are right, and it's doing nothing in this case, so I'm just watching my levels. I drove my levels in here, yes. Drove my input and outputs using this, so I didn't need to use anything else. Normally I have another one of these gains on the front to push things in. I thought, oh, no, I actually should do that inside Volcano to show it doing the whole job. So I push my inputs to get my whole mix level up to the right thing. So with nothing running, I've got my RMS sitting at -12 and my peak at about 0. Then it's time to process. Do hickory, and then work the output gain so that my peaks, in this case, I don't like limiting or compressing hard on the end of a thing. I can go loud if I've got a good mix without it, and that way it balances up nicely. So 2 dB is more than plenty. That might just flick a little bit, but mostly I'm using the soft clipper to just nope. Because the downside of using limiting is that your track goes whoa, 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 and you lose brightness and energy every time it goes whoa. So if you're using a clipper, as long as you're not trying to push 48 dB of gain into this thing, it'll just roll off the spiky bits on top, which aren't adding a lot of value, and in doing so it can actually make the piece even just a tiny bit brighter. So your piece, compared to using the limiter heavily, will breathe and possibly even spark up just a little bit. So rather than losing dynamics with your limiter, because that's what it's doing, it's saying, no, this will leave all your dynamics alone, and if anything, add a little bit of at the same time. So one process really for everything here. We can see some compression happening here. Now, it would have been much nicer for this, rather than using the transient mode, it would have been much nicer to be able to use the envelope mode. Very much. But that would have required a threshold. So unless I'm really missing something, threshold, please. I know you've got the technology for it. Then, rather than having this compressor start to act from nothing, we can have it act from up here, which is far more fitting for a compressor. But nonetheless, even without that, we've still got a very, very good working result. I've just used the transient mode, which means it's just responding to the transients and pushing down. That'll probably be enough to cope in between. And it is, because it sounds really good, really good. So we've got, this looks like it's going to be rolling off an awful lot of stuff, but its frequency point is actually 20k. So we've got the ability to see a whole lot of stuff that's, well, not really a happening thing. Same on the other end. It's rolling off at 30. And I might not commonly roll off at sort of 35, but it's rolling off at 30. I could have chosen more aggressive things here, but I didn't want to. I'm using the peak, which is the resonance, to add a little bit of overall brightness, so it's also acting as a high shelf. And my boost at 6 to give us that overall sense of presence. If you think it's a little bright, fair enough. That's personal choice. This one is pulling a little out, but we don't want to pull a lot out. It's just looking to clarify the whole thing. Where that's going to be is going to be completely up to you and your track. No messing around with mid-side processing. I'm not a fan. I'm not going to say don't do it. I will from time to time on instruments. Just tend not to do it on the mix. Because to me, the mix should sound right already. If my mix sounds wrong, I'm going to go back to my mix, not forward to the master. I understand if you're in a mastering house and you get sent to, I don't know, the Joshua Tree. No, the Joshua Tree was actually fairly well known for being a record that was in part saved in the master. The mastering engineer got it and felt like, oh, this mix doesn't sound like it kind of should. It doesn't sound like it's ready for FM radio, and the Joshua Tree was, like it or not, ready for FM radio, and FM radio was ready for the Joshua Tree. So he did some slightly aggressive for the time work. In terms of mid-siding things, if you don't feel like your record has the right kind of stereo spread, fix it in the mix. If you're doing this yourself, going and saying, oh, well, I'll solve my inability to get my mix right at the masters, is all you're going to do is make it sound weird. And who likes listening to weird records? My hands are staying down. I do not like listening to weird records. I do not mind at all listening to great records with unusual mixes or poor mixes. Not at all. But when somebody's tried to solve a problem and made their record sound weird, especially if it's combined with a let's make everything sound exactly the same, every single track, and let's have written the most thoughtless lyrics that we can so that we don't stand out, there's no reason for me to want to continue to listen to that record, because we haven't suddenly got ourselves a new Bob Dylan. We haven't suddenly got ourselves a new Metallica. We haven't suddenly got ourselves a new anything. We've got a record that's just broken. So mid-side's there, use it in your mix, probably don't use it on your master, is my advice. So very simple EQ, mastering moves, and that compression overall, which is this guy. If we turn that compression off, notice how it's actually bringing some kind of brightness to the mix. Exactly what the math is behind that, don't know, but probably because what's happening is that the kick and the bass in particular, or should be what trigger this, they do add a certain amount of murk because bass is slow. So by using this compression, what we're doing is saying, yes, we'll give you the transients of those, which are bright, and we'll just lower the murk a little bit. We'll lower some of the whoomp out of the mix at that point, in which case overall you get this brighter, cleaner, clearer sounding mix that sounds more exciting and more vibrant, because just drags things down. I mean, think about it, when you're hearing some hyper homie going past in his high quality car, and all you're hearing, do you feel enlivened? Probably you don't. You might be thinking, oh my God, grow a life. And yet, if you hear someone going past with their truck windows rolled down and you're hearing Garth Brooks or the Eagles or whatever, so long as you are not prejudiced against that, and that's not to do with music or psychoacoustics or anything, it's just prejudice, then you'll probably feel like, oh, So bright lifts, drags down. So if you want your piece, even though it is gloomy gothy, to make people feel, oh, then don't push the bottom end too much by doing that little bit of getting rid of our bottom end here. We actually get nicer clarity. The overall different approach to how Volcano might be used, but I took one look at it, and I think Whitesea did as well. Mr. Snake Oil took one look at it and was like, oh, and very, very interesting tool as an alternate EQ device, which then turns out to be able to do compression. So whether that's dynamic EQ or just straight across the board wideband compression, whilst adding very nice saturation, because as I've pointed out several times, you can actually compound your saturations, up to 4 of them on top of each other, either with different styles or the same style, means that you can really build a lot of vibrancy, and that's dealing with a lot of very fast transients. So by the time we get to here, we've got a surprisingly nicely controlled mix, which a little bit more, and look, we've got nothing but this EQ compressor and a thou shalt not pass clipper on the end, and we have a record that is ready to go. Hi, my name again, Benedict, doing these for higher hertz. If you have any questions, polite questions of course, please ask them on down below, preferably after pressing the subscribify button. Always happy to engage and help people get the right results for themselves. You have a great day.